Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Greetings of the day, coming to the third lecture series, second part of the Preamble of the WTO. While allowing for the optimal use of world's resources in accordance with the objective of sustainable development, seeking both to protect and preserve the environment and to enhance the means for doing so in a manner consistent with their respective needs and concern at different level of economic development. This paragraph is also included in the Preamble of the WTO. Now you see earlier part stated about the raising standard of living, considering full employment. I would like to ponder here the full employment is a very idealistic concept, but it talks or it should be sensed as something as maximum possible employment. Or if full employment we consider someone who is gainfully employed or is involved in one or the other method of gaining economically in economic terms, while allowing for the optimal use of world's resources in accordance with the objective of sustainable development. The WTO originally was not having any exclusive agreement on environmental measures, or it was not trying to involve any such basic environment agreement in its key list of agreements, but it has stated certain objectives. I would also like to add, recently it has added an agreement on fisheries, which basically is part of the larger environmental objective. So you can say that gradually the shift is towards including also the environmental objectives. But at the time of its inception, the same was not the case. However, they realized that sustainable development goals cannot be ignored. So the idea was to maintain a balance between trade objectives and the goals that are set by the environment based treaties or the international law treaties that are meant for protecting and safeguarding the environment. So it adopted the idea of sustainable development. That means the trade measures that are meant with development objectives, they must be forwarded keeping in mind the sustainable development goals. Here it also means that in certain cases WTO can allow member states to adopt protectionist measures or certain safeguard measures to protect its environment. But this has also been categorized in the or classified in terms of the countries. I repeat this, the WTO allows member states to adopt protectionist measures for saving its environment. For example, if United States is a developed country and it is importing any product from another developed country, that is European Union, and European Union has exported the same product to United States without following the environmental obligations, then United States has its rights or it has due rights to disallow the same product to be sold in US market, stating that it has not fulfilled its environmental obligations at the time of its manufacture or it has not fulfilled the environmental law standards. The same product, if it is brought from any developing country, then United States may give the relaxation to enter the same product entering its market, allowing the same product entering its market with a condition that after certain period of time or after the developing country has attained the status as the developed nation, must fulfill the environmental obligations. So there are rigidities and flexibilities with regard to the environmental obligations, but the core idea is the principle of sustainable development cannot be lost, or it cannot be deviated without any reasonable justification in terms of gain in trade, in terms of gain in employment objectives, but has to be fulfilled also while using the resources of the world or the nature's resources. Now, these resources of the world includes both living resources as well as non-living resources. Living resources, as I stated now, for example, the fish or other wildlife animals. So, their trade is prohibited and it cannot be argued giving the instance of free trade allowing the trade of those products. Likewise, the use of non-living resources like the fossil fuels or iron ores or other various form of minerals that may be harmful for us or that may be harmful for the human beings, cannot, their import and export cannot be allowed if the environmental standards are not being complied with by the countries. If any product is manufactured using those iron ore, mineral or any such kind of compound. Seeking both to protect and preserve environment and to enhance the means for doing so in a manner consistent with their respective needs and concern at different level of economic development. But WTO also realizes that there is a need for economic development and there are different stages of economic development. So, totally it has not banned or it has not prohibited the use of world's resources, natural resources, even if they may not be viable for the environmental concerns. But there has to be a balance between both the objectives, environmental objectives and the objectives of development. Now, this has been adopted in such a manner because when states, developing states, less developing states, they were introduced as the members, it was very clear that their industrial level or their industrial achievements are far behind compared to the developed nations. So, while going through or while progressing those stages of industrialization, technological advancement, they may not be able to comply with all the environmental obligations, or we can say that they will be facing several failures on different fronts. So, we need to create the space where that can be accommodated, and therefore, this objective or let us say this paragraph of the preamble, it does not give a free way or it does not give a legal sanctity for the developing nations or less developed nation to exploit the environment resources, to use their resources in a disproportionate manner, but simply it is a kind of relaxation being provided, keeping in consideration their historical past, keeping in consideration that they will follow different phases of industrialization and we need to accommodate that. Now, some more factual information about the WTO. Presently, Dr. Nagoi Okanzo-Iweala from Nigeria is the Director General of the World Trade Organization. She is an economist and international development expert with over 30 years of experience. Now, coming to working of the WTO is based on legal and economic concept. As I started that the lecture series stating that we have now a new concept that is working with the international trade institutions, that is international economic law, not simply economic concepts, neither simply the legal concepts, but international economic law. Now, here the WTO has adopted those concepts and the most significant of that is comparative cost advantage. Now, the comparative cost advantage is an improvement in the absolute advantage. I compare these two concepts and clarify that why the WTO has adopted comparative cost advantage. First, I start with absolute advantage. As per the absolute advantage theory, country A good in manufacturing, cloth. Country B, good in manufacturing wine. So, as per the absolute advantage theory, they must specialize in whatever they can manufacture the best. So, country A must specialize, and not only specialize but use its labor potential in manufacturing cloth, and country B should use its labor force in manufacturing wine, and then they both should trade with each other. So, the consumers of country A will get good quality wine, and consumers of country B will get good quality of cloth. That is what it means by absolute advantage theory. But the question arises, there is always a tendency of saturation in the market, or the market will saturate at some point of time, where the people from country A, they will not be willing to buy wine. Their taste may change and they would prefer to get something new. So, at that point of time, what will be the fate of the resources and the labor force that is being employed by country B? Likewise, the consumers from country B, they may be willing to buy cloth of different nature. Instead of buying the similar cloth from country A or the cloth of same quality from country A, they may switch over to some other variety. Their fashion may change. So, at that time there will be slump in the market situation of country A. Therefore, there has to be certain alternatives, and also the factors that are used for producing the goods, they have to be employed in a very rational manner. So, the comparative cost advantage, that was a more rational approach, or is a more rational approach, mainly adopted in the WTO, and this was advocated by David Ricardo. Now, what is comparative cost advantage theory? Comparative cost theory says that if country A can manufacture, why to go for the best goods? Let us say it can manufacture better quality goods by employing various factors of production. Okay, let us say it manufactures better quality goods X, Y, Z. These are the three goods country A can manufacture, but they are not of the best quality, but better quality. Now, country B, better quality goods, let us put it 1, 2, 3. Now, these better quality goods are produced, but not the best quality, because of various factors. They are considered as depending upon various factors of production. They can produce better goods because of the various factors of production. For example, maybe A has good labor, secondly A has good technological skill, but it does not has raw material. All right. Country B has a good extent of raw materials, but not other factors like good laborers or cheap labor. It does not has skillful engineers, or let us say it does not has proper investors. So, both these countries, they should not simply trade between these goods X, Y, Z and 1, 2, 3, but they should use they should interchange the factors of production, making a comparison between, they should make the comparison between different factors of production. I put it like this: comparison between different factors of production instead of goods. Okay. So, A, here we put it country A, labor is good, skill good, country B, let us put it, they have good investment, they have good land. Okay. So, they should interchange these factors of production, interchange, and then select what best they can produce. So, based on this theory, we can accommodate many countries. How we can accommodate many countries in the WTO? Like the developing nations or the less developed nation, they may be able to provide labor at a cheaper cost, they may be able to provide raw materials at a cheaper cost, they may have abundance of land, and that can be used by the multinational companies who have better skills, who have better know-how, and as a consequence of it, both will be benefited. And for that is how the many of the manufacturing units, they have moved to China, because China can provide them labors at a very cheap rate, efficient labor at a cheap rate. Sometimes they can also provide land, other avenues for the manufacturing and assembling. That is why many of the manufacturing sector of the advanced nation or the developed countries, they have moved to China. Now, applying this comparative cost advantage, it creates a picture that even the small country, even if it's not good at manufacturing anything, but at least their population can be used as a efficient labor, as a labor at providing labor at a cheaper cost, or if not, then they can be used for the assembly line. So, that is the way how comparative cost advantage theory has practically given the idea and created the scope for developed countries, developing countries, and the least developed countries, and many times it has been successful. Now, compare it with the absolute advantage theory, where the trade was confined to whoever produced the good in the best manner. It should trade with another country which produces another good in the best possible manner. But what about the factors of production that are used or that can be used in manufacturing a bit lesser quality good, or the situation where the market has saturated? So, those were not discussed, or those things cannot be accommodated in the absolute advantage theory, whereas these things can be accommodated in the comparative cost advantage theory. And this key economic principle is adopted in the WTO, which was propounded by David Ricardo. Comparative cost advantage, the theory of comparative advantage emerged during this period and strengthened our understanding of the nature of international trade and its benefits. David Ricardo has received most of the credit for developing this important theory, although James Mill and Robert Torrance had similar ideas around the same time. It was not purely David Ricardo who propounded this, there were other economists and political thinkers, or the political economic thinkers, who had similar such suggestion, but mainly the credit goes to David Ricardo. The theory of comparative advantage suggests that a country export goods in which its relative cost advantage and not their absolute cost advantage is greatest in comparison to other countries. Relative cost advantage means that at least if we make the comparison of manufacturing goods, of the like goods between two countries, then one has a more advantage with regard to the other country. So, and that advantage has to be further, let us say, analyzed, that what are the factors that has led to that advantage, and those factors can be mobilized for manufacturing that product in that sense. However, gains from the trade depend upon relative strength of elasticity of demand for export and import goods, size of the country, changes in technology, supply of goods traded in general. Now, one cannot confine itself that this concept is panacea to all these problems, market problems, or it must create long lasting hope to the people, those who have uh, adopted the international trade measures according to the WTO, or it can be remedied for all kind of market failures. But relatively, one has to take into consideration what are the relative strengths of elasticity of demand and export and import of goods, because export and import of the goods very much also depend upon the extent of elasticity of demand in the countries where they are either imported and from where they are exported. Like if the demand is less for whatever reasons, maybe there is a slump going on in a country, or the consumers' taste and preferences have changed, or they find the similar product at a cheaper price, then definitely the exporter has to bear the losses, even if that has applied the comparative cost advantage theory. So these factors need also to be considered alongside. Size of the country, that means the extent of population, the land area, the movement of goods, and the population of the age group. I mean the population that varies between the age group, that has to be also taken into consideration. Like if someone is keen in exporting fashionable products, then it depends upon the extent of youth of a country. If they have more of the oldies, then definitely that product won't be very popular. Changes in technology. Now there are two things when we talk about the changes in technology. One is its utility, and the other is simply the fashion. Like many times there is change in technology not out of necessity, or not because that can be very helpful, but simply to create a brand or to create a style. So that may have a short term effect on the consumers, but if it is mainly for necessity, or it can solve many of the utility based problems of the consumers, then definitely that will have a longer demand, despite the fact that it is expensive, or despite the fact that its manufacturing is less. Supply of goods traded in general. So when we talk about the export of the goods, then how easily they are available to the consumers, whether it goes through a very cumbersome process, or they have to follow many legal procedures. So that kind of things are also, or they are easily available in the general grocery shop. So that factors are also very relevant here. Greater than elasticity in the foreign demand for export, and greater the elasticity of foreign demand for imports, greater will be the gains from trade. Now it depends upon the extent of elasticity. If there is inelasticity, that means despite the rise in price of that imported product, people will go for it, even if the price has increased for whatever reasons. But if it is, the demand is very much elastic, very much depending upon the variance in price, then you can understand that a sudden hike in price will decrease the demand of that product. So these kind of factors, despite the core principle of comparative cost advantage is adopted, do play a great role. Further, trade theory based on comparative cost advantage theory leads to increased competition. Now there are many advantages by adopting this. One of them is it leads to increased competition. How it leads to increased competition? Because the states that are involved in import and export, they will try, and since the comparative cost advantage is not confined to the sale of goods, the sale of final product of the good, but it goes even a bit step deeper, that it tries to figure out what are the factors of production, what are the determinants of those production. Then the nations or those manufacturers, they would like how to improve those factors of production, how to make them more efficient, how readily those determinants are available. So they can focus on the sub areas and they can make that more productive, more efficient. Now, as a result of making those efforts or putting those efforts, they can make it more competitive. Okay, for example, like I stated to you, if labor cost in Japan is high, take the example, labor cost in Japan is high, but that is not the case in China. So if the good that is manufactured in Japan costs 1000 yen and similar product is manufactured by Germany and that cost around 1100 yen. So there is a difference of 100 yen. But the Japanese want that there should be, or the Germans want that there should be increase in their demand. Now that can only be possible if they reduce the price. But if they reduce the price, the same good being manufactured in their home country, then they will have to bear the loss. So they will consider what are the factors of production, and labor is one of the factor. So they can get a cheaper labor in the Chinese market, and if they apply the labor in the Chinese market from the Chinese market, then the cost of the production of that good goes down to, let's say, again 1000 yen. Then now they are in equal competition with Japan. So that way it creates competition. Now someone can ask me that if Japan also thinks in getting the same good manufactured in China using the Chinese labor cost, so that will further reduce the cost of production of the Japanese good in comparison to the German good. Then what will be the other way out? That the Germans will have to find out what are the other factors of production, and they will have to sharpen it, or they will have to make it more economical, make it more relatively better in comparison to the Japanese good. By and large, what will be the effect? The goods that are manufactured in that way, they are more competitive. And finally, who is benefited? The consumers, they get benefited. Now, that is how the comparative cost advantage has to be seen. Competition enhances efficiency. Least developed countries gain largely in this competitive world. Now, earlier, by applying the absolute advantage theory or the mercantilist theory, the least developed countries, they could not play any role because no one will think of their product. But now it is not the question of their product, but it is the question of the factors of production they are using. So the least developed countries, they can make the contribution by those factors of production that are available with them. Improved research and technology of the developed world flow in these countries. And what else? With regard to the developed countries, they can keep on enhancing their comparative technologies. As just now I have stated the example of Germany and Japan. So if they both turn out to be the market rival, and they found that now they don't have any factors left where they can improve, but certainly there is one thing that is left with them: how better they can do in technological terms, or whose technology is more better. So that always remains there. Improvement of technology is always there. Openness to trade support technological upgrading via learning. Evidences of learning and technological upgradation is observed in many activities, mainly in manufacturing and service sector. And this we observe in all respect, that is both in manufacturing and in the service sector. Manufacturing I have just quoted to you. With regard to the service sector, as service sector includes here or mainly covers the human resources, the kind of quality skills that is with the human beings, and how that can be improved. So those services can be improved by better infrastructure, by better educational skills, or by making better the educational standards of those human resources. So explaining how the World Trade Organization basically functions. It has its own hierarchical order. At the top is Ministerial Conference, which is represented by either the head of the state, sometime by commerce ministers or finance ministers. Then just below the Ministerial Conference there is a General Council, which is mainly the executive body that sets the agenda and also that helps the agenda that has been stated by the Ministerial Conference to be executed. General Council take care of the two separate bodies that basically are independent, like Dispute Settlement Body and Trade Policy Review Body. The function of Dispute Settlement Body is to resolve the disputes that arises between the member states of the WTO concerning the trade issues. Trade Policy Review Body looks after whether the WTO member states they have followed the WTO obligations, whether they are complying with those agreements and whether they have made the reforms that are so required. Now, just below the General Council there are several committees. Firstly, I take it from the left hand side. First set of committees cover trade and environment issues, second trade and development issues, thirdly regional trade agreements, fourthly committee on balance of payment restrictions, next is committee on budget, finance and administration. Second series covers committee on market access, custom valuation, agriculture rules of origin, sanitary and phytosanitary measure and import licensing, committees related to technical barriers to trade, committee relating to trade related investment measures and finally committee relating to anti-dumping practices. Next is committees with regard to trade in financial services, committees with regard to specific commitments, working power, working parties, domestic regulation, GATS rule. GATS is General Agreement on Trade in Services. Next series of committees include Trade Negotiation Committee that covers Agriculture Committee, Trade and Development Committee, Trade and Environment Committee. Now, then there are also councils, Service Council, TRIPS Council, Dispute Settlement Body Council. The WTO's 12th Ministerial Conference took place from 12 to 17 June 2022 at WTO headquarters in Geneva. Ministers from across the world attended to review the functioning of the multilateral trade system. The next ministerial conference will take place at Abu Dhabi. Now comes the main principle, that is free trade principle adopted by the WTO. I have already explained to you what the free trade means. Free trade principle means to liberate the market economy of a nation. That means there should be no tariff based restrictions, there should not be any protectionist measures adopted by the country with regard to the goods that are imported in that market. But then there is a question with regard to the fair trade. Now, what do we mean by the fair trade? First question is whether WTO accepts the principle of fair trade. Now, WTO does not accept fair trade as a core principle, but WTO accepts fair trade as a supplementary principle, or you can say accept it as a secondary principle, but the primary principle is the free trade principle. Now, how to make the distinction? Like free trade principle is the primary principle. With regard to the secondary principle, this has been explained very well by HLA Hurd, that secondary principles are those to fulfill the objectives of the secondary principle. We have to create bylaws. They are not available in the form of rights to us. For example, I have a fundamental right to speak, and that follows the part of primary principle, but I do not have the right to create a contract. Of course, if I make a contract with another person and whatever rights are created after that, so whatever rights are created by virtue of my signing a contract with other person, that is of secondary nature. So the primary thing is that I have a fundamental right, and because of that fundamental right, I do have the right to create the contract. But what kind of rights are created by virtue of that contract, that forms the part of the secondary right principle. So the fair trade is of such nature in the WTO. Basically, it talks about the free trade. That means the nation should reduce its barrier and all these things. But whether every nation should be given equal opportunity to trade, that cannot be promised. But in certain accounts, it talks about the fair trade, for example, sustainable development, giving a reasonable chance to developing nations, economies of the developing nations, giving chance for raising the standard of living. All these are part of the fair trade objectives, or if not purely fair trade objectives, closer to the fair trade objectives. Now, the debate on fair trade goes back to the Roman law principle. The Roman law principle is cited here because they were the first one to use the codified system of law. Classical Roman law did not require that a price be fair. It is permitted by nature for one party to buy for less and other to sell for more, and thus each is allowed to outwit the other. The earlier Roman law, prior to the Justinian code, they believed that it is basically the will of the party to decide what should be the price. Now I tell you, or I explain this to you with a very relative example. Now this is the pen. Take this as a pen. What should be its fair price? Whether the fair price of this pen should be based on demand and supply of the market, or the price which the customer is willing to pay and the owner is willing to sell, or should we determine the price, the fair price of this pen, depending upon whatever cost has been invested in manufacturing this pen, and any price quoted after that should be considered as the fair price. So it depends how you determine the fairness in the market. Now the early Roman legal system prior to the Justinian code, they believed it is up to an individual's choice if he is willing to sell at that price and the buyer is ready to buy at that price, so that automatically determines the fair price. But the Justinian code, they had a different method to understand this. They believed, added at a later stage probably by Justinian, giving remedy to one who sold land for less than half of the price. So that means if someone has sold a good to a lesser price than its original price, or the price that the good has its worth, must be compensated. In such cases, buyer has to rescind the transaction or make the difference between the price paid and the just price. The medieval jurists such as Briclogus interpreted this text to apply to buyers as well as sellers and parties to analogous contracts. Now comes free trade. This were the explanation about the fair price or fair trade. About the free trade, what it strikes to, or what are its key objectives. One is that increases efficiency. It talks about that we must work in most efficient manner, and that efficiency is created or generated by competition. Now within the competition, again we can start a debate about the fairness, that is whether the competition is fair or not. Next thing it talks about is price based on demand and supply. So free trade, as you know, decides the price of the good not based on its worth or what is its actual value, but depending upon how much the buyer is willing to pay. So demand and supply theory works here. Free trade is anti-protectionist. That means it is antithesis to any such protectionist measure being adopted. Whereas fair trade can lead us to the protectionist measure if those fair trade goals are not complied with or they are not meant to be abided. So, the nation can adopt those protectionist measures. For example, with regard to the environmental goals, with regard to the subsidies or dumping measures. Now, I would also like to elaborate here what were the differences between GATT and the WTO. I have emphasized that WTO is basically a transformation of the GATT, and WTO has accepted or adopted, would be the right term, most of the agreements and further elaborated those agreements of the GATT. But what is the difference between these two? GATT can be described as a set of rules and multilateral trade agreements that came into force to encourage international trade and remove cross-country trade barriers. So, as stating before you simply, basically it was a creation of rules as a stepping stone to establish a multilateral trade system where the nations can try that how it will be if they liberalize their market, to encourage international trade and remove cross-country trade barriers. Whereas WTO is an international organization that came into existence to oversee and liberalize trade between countries. So, basically this is a purely a multilateral based international organization that is to oversee and liberalize trade between. Oversee here means that since it is an supranational body, so it will take into consideration whether the nations are abiding by its rules, regulations and set order or not. And primarily it will make effort that nations do liberalize the trade while creating trade relation between each other. GATT was not having an institutional existence, but had a small secretariat. So, as it was basically a contract or the set of agreements, and therefore, to supervise it they had a small secretariat to have its functioning, it has a small secretariat. But a while ago I have explained to you WTO is having its own committees, it has its general council and even various other subcommittees that are working for it. That is to make the institution stronger and more effective in comparison to the earlier agreement, which was a kind of a foundation stone for the WTO. WTO is a permanent institution along with a secretariat. So, it is a permanent institution with its own body, its own objectives and character. Participant nations of the GATT were termed as contracting parties. As explained, that they are not termed as member state, they are termed as contracting parties because they have signed the contract. Participant nations of the WTO are termed as member states. The rules of the GATT were only for trade in goods. It was short scale start, so they only took how to resolve the issues related to trade in goods. Whereas rules of the WTO include services and aspects of intellectual property along with the goods. Now, the WTO is not only confined with the issues related to goods, but it also includes services, as I have explained, general agreement on trade and trade in services, and services includes here the human resources and aspects of intellectual property, since it very much propounds or it promotes the ideas how the technology can be progressed and how far someone can be benefited by the sale of technology. So, it has included intellectual property law or intellectual property right. Now, it is not simply they have included the rules of intellectual property, but if a member state of the WTO does not comply with the intellectual property obligations, then certain restrictions on its free movement of goods or other agreements, obligations under the other agreements, or if it is benefited through other agreements can be restricted. That means, if country A is supposed to comply the intellectual property obligations. It also, the country A is also exporting goods, maybe clothes, maybe cars, maybe electronics to other countries, but it is not complying with the intellectual property obligations. So in order to enforce those compliance, country A, the goods from the country A could be embargoed, or the restrictions can be imposed on the export of the goods from that country. GATT agreements were originally multilateral, but plurilateral agreements were added to it later. So originally the GATT was multilateral system, but later on plurilateral agreements were further added, which led to the groupings, and that further led to dysfunctioning of the GATT system fairly. Whereas WTO agreements are purely multilateral in nature, except that few of them are plurilateral. Domestic legislation consistent or inconsistent of GATT obligations were allowed. Now, since it was a very loosely created system, therefore the GATT system, or the states that are contracting party to the GATT system, can have their rules or their domestic legislation that are not in compliance with the GATT rules. So that kind of thing was existing in the GATT, and that weakened the functioning of GATT. Whereas in case of the WTO, since it is a treaty based system, the states that are party to it, they are supposed to set their domestic legal system. They are supposed to enact the laws that are not inconsistent with the WTO. They should be consistent with the WTO. So if the WTO talks about intellectual property right, then the member states of the WTO, they must enact the laws that are promoting the intellectual property rights as stated by the WTO. If the WTO talks about not giving subsidies, then the member states of the WTO, they must enact laws that are not allowing the giving of subsidies. They are discarding, or they are prohibiting the use of subsidies. GATT dispute settlement system was slow and ineffective. So the functioning of any such international system very much depends upon the kind of dispute settlement system it does have. If it does not have a very strong dispute settlement system, then the states party to it will not be having faith. So GATT was of similar nature. They do not have a very certain dispute settlement system, that led to its weakening. Whereas WTO has a very settled and strong dispute settlement system, and that led to its strengthening. However, presently there is a crisis going on in the WTO dispute settlement system, because with regard to the appointment of members in the appellate body. So many countries, they wish the members that are appointed in the appellate body, they must be from their side, or they must be through their support, whereas many countries are not willing the appointment of members of the appellate body through their side. So that has led to a big stalemate in the WTO dispute settlement system presently. Now coming to the list of agreements that are part of the WTO. WTO came into existence after Marrakesh Agreement establishing it. Marrakesh Agreement, as I have stated, that earlier when GATT was functioning within the GATT system, many such discussions originated that led to the formation of the WTO, and finally it was the Marrakesh Agreement that led to its establishment. Now in its main agreement talks about the treaty obligations. Within that is the preamble of the WTO. Along with that treaty agreement, there are list of other agreements contained in various annexures. Like Annexure 1A talks about multilateral agreement on trade in goods. Within that there are different set of sub agreements or list of different agreements, that is general agreement on tariff and trade, that is firstly the GATT agreement, and I have stated to you earlier that the GATT agreement is as it is included in the WTO. So, you can see here when we talk about the multilateral agreement on trade in goods, the first multilateral agreement on trade in goods that is covered is GATT 1994. Second one is agreement on agriculture. Third one is sanitary and phytosanitary measure. Fourth one is agreement on textile and clothing, which is terminated now. Fifth one is agreement on technical barriers to trade. Sixth is trade related investment measures. Seventh is anti-dumping agreement, that is implementation of Article 6 of the GATT. Eighth one is custom valuation agreement. Ninth one is pre-shipment inspection agreement. 10th is rules of origin. 11th is agreement on import licensing procedures. 12th is agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures. 13th agreement on safeguard measures, and 14th agreement on trade facilitation. After annexure 1A, there is annexure 1B, that is general agreement on trade in services, that covers general agreement on trade in services. Next is annexure 1C, that covers trade related aspect of intellectual property rights. This was the list of agreements under annexure 1A. Then is annexure 2, which is a separate annexure, talks about dispute settlement understanding. Annexure 3 talks about trade policy review mechanism. Annexure 4 talks about the plurilateral trade agreements. The plurilateral trade agreement I have explained, that is agreement within the multilateral agreement between certain member states. Mainly they are trade in civil aircraft, government procurement, amendment agreement on government procurement 2012, international dairy agreement, international bovine meat agreement, which is terminated. International dairy agreement is also terminated. Then we start with one of the very key agreement covered under multilateral agreement on trade in goods, that is subsidies. So, I start with the concept of subsidies in general. Now, the first is, what do we understand by the term subsidy as a layman? If someone asks me, then very readily I will say subsidy is something opposite of taxation. In case of taxation, it is basically the government that collects the money, whereas in case of subsidies, it is basically the government that provides money or support to the people. So, in a way it is totally reverse of the taxation, and in subsidy it is basically the tax money which the government gives to its people. Now, classifying it in terms will be really a complex thing, and there are certain terminologies which do have an overlapping effect while explaining the term subsidy. Those are state aid, grant, bounty, and subsidies under the WTO. Subsidies under WTO are separately explained here because subsidies in general is an economic concept, but subsidies under WTO is defined in a very respective manner, or respective here means is defined within the context of certain parameters. Now, firstly, I start with what do we mean by the term state aid. State aid is something where the state provides support, mainly the financial support, for certain measures which is not feasible without state support. That means without the intervention of state, that objective cannot be achieved. The example can be if a nation that is depending upon nuclear support measure for its generation of electricity decides to go for a renewable source or a safe measure, but now has to spend a lot. Or let's say any industry that is depending upon fossil fuels wants to shift it to sustainable measures, has to depend upon lot of financial burden. For that reason, it can request for the state support, and that kind of support is termed as state aid. Thank you very much for being part of this lecture series. I'll continue with the state aid in the next lecture. Thank you very much.
Many a times we all think, who am I? Why am I doing whatever I am doing? Why do I feel attracted towards others? Why do I feel very aggressive in certain instances? Why certain people or certain type of acts, they repel me? Why is it that I always search for certain things which look very, very ambiguous? These are the things, these are the questions that all of us experience, all human beings. And you would realize that many a times certain domains of knowledge, especially within social sciences and all sciences at large, when you look at it from a philosophical point of view, they would try to give you the answers to these questions. Now, one of the branches of understanding which helps you understand things much better, which also helps you understand not only what is visibly present before you, what is glaringly apparent to you, rather which also tells you what is not visible at all, what goes within. Okay. And this is the subject knowledge, what is called as psychology. It is not only that it helps you understand the manifested behavior, the overt behavior, how you talk, how you speak, how you say it, how you interact, how you respond, not only that, but also what goes within, what makes you do this, what makes you think this way, what makes you act that way. Why is it that certain things you appreciate, certain things you feel attracted towards, and why is it that many a times in certain type of situations you feel you should completely go out of it, you should not get anyway involved into it, the repulsion. Why is it that certain acts, although you do not appreciate, still you get involved into it? Then you reinterpret your own behavior and you start giving birth to certain type of experiences, shame, guilt, pleasure, appreciation. You see world in a particular way, you analyze it in a particular way, you derive emotion out of it, feeling out of it, and the mix of what you perceived along with what you experience, it makes you act in a particular way, respond in a particular way. Your response is received by somebody else, and then the other person also responds in that situation. Now, there are situations where several people interact simultaneously. The situation remains constant and different people interact at the same time. You realize that your identity gets lost. You are not an individual. You act what is called as group behavior. You realize that you do not have an explanation for either favoring somebody or completely being unfavorable to the other person. You later on realize that it was a favorable or an unfavorable attitude towards that individual. You realize that you repeat certain form of behavior. Why? You do not know. People tell you that such type of repetitions are not normal. Human beings largely do not do that. And then you realize that okay, this is a particular pattern of a behavior for which I require the help of a specialist. The specialist tells me that this pattern of behavior is given a particular taxonomy, a particular nomenclature, which is either some aberration in the normal behavior, it is a neurotic form of a behavior, psychotic form of a behavior, it could be a psychosomatic response. And psychology, it covers all of this. So, if you want to understand yourself, if you want to understand others, this is the subject which helps you achieve that target. It is behavioral sciences that makes you understand human beings, human responses, human existence in complete totality.